Welcome to the final episode of this review series, Review 1.3. For our rhythm warm-up today, we will continue exploring 3/4 time. For our 2-5-1 progression exercise, we will look at the last 3 keys on the circle today, that is E flat, B flat, and F. And for our reading, I wrote a little piece of classical music to kind of look at how modes can be used in a classical setting, all right? So we'll be thinking about diatonically using modes and how to step outside of the key with mode borrowing. As always, you can find these outlines, sheet music, and much more at my website, pianodojo.com. Don't forget to subscribe or share this channel with anybody who is looking for answers about the piano. But let's go ahead and get rhythmically warmed up. Let's get started on rhythm warm-up number 46. We're going to be at 60 BPM, and the clicks of the metronome are going to represent all 3 of the upbeats in line 1. Let's give it a try. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Switch hands. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Hands together. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Let's have some fun with line 2. What we're going to do is speed up to 66 BPM, but the metronome is going to be cut in a third. So the metronome will be at 22 BPM, and each of those clicks is only going to represent the first upbeat of each measure. Let's give it a try on line 2. One, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Switch hands. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Top line. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. For line 3, we're going to speed up just a bit. We'll be at 72 BPM now, which means our metronome is going to be cut down to 24 BPM. And now the metronome clicks are going to represent the second upbeat of each measure for line 3. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Switch hands. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Top line. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Last but not least, for line 4, we will speed up to 81 BPM, which means we'll be cutting our metronome down to 27 BPM, and now each metronome click is going to represent the third upbeat of each measure. Let's give it a try on line 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Switch hands. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Top line. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Now that we're all rhythmically warmed up, let's head back to the piano for the rest of our lesson. For the last installment of our 2-5-1 review, we will be looking at the key of E flat, B flat, and F. Of course, this is only ever going to be written down in the key of C because it is up to us to transpose these concepts into all 12 keys, but we will do that together on the keyboard Let's take a look. For our final 2-5-1 review, we'll be starting in the key of E flat major. And that means that we're going to start with an F minor 7 chord. That will be inversion blended to a B flat dominant 7th chord. And then that will be inversion blended to our E flat major 7. Our scales will be F Dorian, B flat mixolydian, and E flat major. When we put our hands together, it's going to look like this: F minor 7, B flat dominant 7, and E flat major 7. For the key of B flat major, I'm going to start with this C minor sort of high up here, and then I'm going to inversion blend that to our F dominant 7, and then finally we're going to take the bottom 2 notes down to our B flat major 7 chord. The scales that we're going to be using are C Dorian, F mixolydian, and B flat major. Remember, when you're playing your scales, you can never really play them too high. Sometimes people are saying, oh, you know, I don't like starting that high because it sounds like I'm going too high, but actually the top octave of the piano is a great place to play scales. It's a great place to put things. It's very crystal clear, and sometimes when you're in an ensemble, it can be the octave that cuts through the ensemble the best. So let's go ahead and try this hands together. We're going to start with our C minor 7, F dominant 7, and B flat major 7. Our final key will be the key of F major. We'll start on a G minor 7 chord. We'll inversion blend that to a C dominant 7th chord, and then we'll have our F major 7. The scales that we'll be using are G Dorian, C mixolydian, and F major. Altogether, that's going to look like this: G minor 7, C dominant 7, and F major. For today's reading, I wrote a small sonatina for us in the key of F major. And the concepts that I want to visit today are how we can think about classical music in terms of diatonic modes, which is basically just any notes that are available to us inside of the key signature. And then also how we can step outside of the key signature a little bit with something called mode borrowing. Let's jump in and check this out. It's always a good idea before you do any actual chord analysis to make sure that you understand what the form of the song is. Now, because this is a sonatina, we know that we're going to have 3 different sections. We're going to have our exposition, we're going to have our development, and then we're going to have our recapitulation. So with that in mind, let's take each of these sections one at a time and look at the harmonies inside. There are many ways to analyze a piece of music. Since we've been doing so for hundreds of years, the system involves some things that were developed hundreds of years ago, some things that are pretty new, some things rooted in classical, some things rooted in jazz. And honestly, I think that it is our job as somebody who is fluent in the language of music or wants to be fluent in the language of music to sort of understand all of these systems. And guess what? I think that we can understand music better through using multiple systems. And so we might be tempted at first to jump in and get really nitty-gritty and try to analyze each one of these chords. But there's sort of a bigger picture here that I think encapsulates more of what the composer was trying to do here. And what was happening was sort of this modal thing, okay? So as we can see, basically what's happening is I really based this piece around this idea of walking up in some kind of third. And at the beginning of the piece, you can see that these thirds are walking up with no additional accidentals. So these modes are what we would call completely diatonic. We're just walking up the modes of the scale in thirds, completely diatonic, which means only using the notes available to us in the key of F major. So instead of labeling each of these chords, I'm just going to label the process that's happening here. I'm going to say this is a modal walk-up and it is diatonic. But as we can see in the next two measures, we are adding accidentals. And so we're going to be borrowing from some closely related modes. Let's see how we do that. In our second measure, our thirds are going to continue to rise, but now we are going to be borrowing our modes from the common tone diminished chord. Common tone borrowing is exactly what it sounds like. Two chords that are different, but they share a common tone. In this case, we have F major, which is our key, and we also have F diminished. Okay, so in this measure, we are borrowing the A flat and the C flat from the key of F diminished, our common tone diminished chord, which sounds kind of nice like that. In our third measure, we are also going to be borrowing from a diminished chord, but this is actually the 7. We know that the 7 is a diminished chord, and in this instance right here, we're going to be borrowing from that mode. Now you could think of this in a few other ways. You could think of this as the minor 4, or you could also think about it as the 2 of F minor. But I think that the simplest way to think about it is that we're using a diminished chord here that happens to be a common tone diminished chord, and we're using a diminished chord here that happens to be the 7, okay? Now, we do end up with a little bit of functional harmony right here, where we finally do approach the 5-7 of the 5, our secondary dominant, and then we do hit a big 5-7 for this whole measure. As you can see, in this second line, I'm really laying into the common tone diminished chord that I set up at the beginning, because the essence of a sonatina is that when you introduce material, you want to continue to use that. So although we introduced two diminished tones, we're going to start by exploring the common tone diminished. So what we have is this alternation between the 1 and the common tone diminished chords, so F and F diminished. Again, our walk up in thirds is going to return with the common tone diminished sound again, which is going to take us to our 4, and then a minor 4, which again, remember the minor 4 is also sort of a member of the diminished 7th. So that, that's where that is justified from. And then ultimately we're going to get to our 5-7. The thing about this is that when I was first composing this and I was walking up in these modes, ultimately what we are listening for is the voice leading. One of the things that you're going to notice as you play these rising lines is that the voices are all leading to each other very nicely. So sometimes in composing, you do come up with a theory that will guide you. And in my case, the only thing I thought of from the beginning was that I wanted to move up in thirds, and then maybe use a little bit of diminished color to just add some variation in there. But then as you start constructing the piece and you start laying it out, the voice leading sometimes begins to show you things that you hadn't even imagined at first. So I'd like to say that I had perfectly planned all of these notes out, but a lot of times it was just the beginning idea that I had, and then as I was plotting them out, the voice leading actually sort of lent itself to telling me where to go next, okay? Now, up until this point, I've really been focusing on the bass clef because I think that's where a lot of the harmonic action is. The right hand or the melodic material is basically just sort of the same idea, but being sequenced into different areas of the F major scale. There's not as much mode borrowing going on in the right hand. There are a few places where it does add some accidentals to correspond with our common tone diminished chords, but for the most part, the right hand is just sort of decorating all of the really pretty voice leading that's happening in the left hand, and not really spinning out much new ideas, but sort of just taking this main idea here and moving it into different spots within the F major scale. So trying to be a well-behaved composer, I still stuck with what we have been dealing with at this point. I've sort of put us into the 1 and the common tone diminished chord sound, along with a little bit of 5/7 streaked in there. And so I wrapped this up very traditionally, going back and forth between the 1 and the common tone diminished. Here we have a very, very classical thing to do, which is where you, every beat, go back and forth between a 1, 5/7, 1, 5/7, and then surprise, a little bit of a deceptive cadence here where the 5/7 dumps you off not on F major, but on F diminished. And then we do correct that real fast and wrap up the ear quite nicely on a simple 1 to 5/7 cadence. However, I do want you to know that this is not the most stable cadence possible, right? Our left hand is in first inversion, so there is an A in the bass instead of an F, and that's because this piece is not over, and so we don't want to give you a full resolution yet. We want to keep a little tension in there so that the ear kind of expects to keep going into the development. The development starts here at measure 13. And by the nature of the development, this is where we can get a little bit harmonically crazy, all right? And so I'm going to offer some twists and turns harmonically speaking. And because of that, I don't always like to use Roman numerals when analyzing the development. I think Roman numerals are really useful when you have a clear key center and most of the time you're playing around that key center. But in this case, because we're going to move our key centers around quite a bit, I'm just going to label the chords as they are named. And then we can ourselves choose how we want to think about that organization. But I just think it's easier when you move your key center around a whole bunch to just name the chords instead of trying to fit them into the Roman numeral mold. So we are going to be changing our system just a little bit here. I also want you to notice that we have really chilled out with the rhythm here, okay? And so this really offers some contrast, not just because we are going to be harmonically offering contrast here, but rhythmically everything slows down with quarter notes, no more 16th notes, very few 8th notes. So that's also another cool way to provide contrast rhythmically. So as you can see with these chord changes, we have A minor and E, and G minor and D7. Both of these are in a relationship of a fifth, okay? But here's the deal. I wanted to add a little bit of a different color. So instead of using the modes of the regular minors, I chose to use the modes of the harmonic minors. So each of these is sort of being treated like a harmonic minor, and then its corresponding fifth is sort of like the fifth mode of that harmonic minor. All that means is that A harmonic minor, but instead of from A to A, it would be from E to E, or it would be G harmonic minor, but instead of from G to G, we would be going from D to D. That gives us a little bit of a darker sound, and that's sort of what I was going for here, and that is, surprise, surprise, you can use the modes of your minor scales as well. We do have some unusual progressions here, but I've circled some notes that lead us to these unusual progressions very gracefully through some very, very basic voice leading. So for example, right here, we don't usually go from E to G minor, but look how beautifully those voices lead each other to those harmonies. Again, we don't usually go from D7 to a C minor, but it just so happens that these two notes resolve very well from the D7 mode to our C minor. Again, that's even going to happen right here in our key of C minor. We don't usually go from C minor back to D7, but let's take a look at the next line of our development section. So C minor to D7 is a bit strange, but it works because of the way that the voices are leading. And then we do get some more traditional chord motion right here, 1 and 5 relationship. However, again, we're going to now start to shift back to the recap, all right? So we want to start lining ourselves back up to get back to F. And I just love the sound of the major 6, which is what D is in the key of F, the major 6 to the 1. It's a very cinematic sound. I'm going to play it for you, and you tell me if you understand which cinematic sound this might sound like. Here we have our D major, and here we have an F major. You can see that they have a common tone. You can see that this voice only moves by a whole step, and that this voice only moves by a half step, okay? And so, although this is not exactly circle of fifths motion, the voice leading is very elegant, and there are some cinematic moments that I'm sure you can relate to through that sound. And once we do get to F, then we can just set up a nice 5/7, and that will take us very gracefully back into a more diatonic way of thinking for the recapitulation. Now, I kind of treated this recapitulation like a Bach invention in a way, and in a way I've always thought that sonatinas were very similar to inventions, except that you could use chords a little bit more, whereas inventions you really just try to stick to two voices. But here what's going on is we can see the return of our melody, but I inverted it, okay? So our rising thirds, and in this case they are just purely diatonic thirds, are in the right hand, while the return of the melody actually happens in the left hand. Most of this material is exactly the same as the first time we saw it, except for it being inverted, and maybe a few tweaks to some melodic lines. For example, right here, we tweaked the melody just a little bit because it functions just slightly differently when you invert it like we did, but nothing that big to really change what was happening. We have our common tone diminished chord, we have our actual seventh diminished chord, all in the same place. But now, looking at the second line of the recap, that's where some cool stuff happens, okay? I always find that the end of the recap is probably the most epic place. And the way that I approached that was by using a harmony that was set up at the very beginning, but that we haven't quite approached yet, so that we get the drama that's been happening, but we also get sort of this new final spectacular thing, this new firework that we haven't seen yet, and we are saving it for the finale. So let's take a look at what these chords are right here. So at this point in this piece, our ears are expecting to hear a flip-flop between the one and some kind of diminished chord, but instead of using the common tone diminished chord that we've really sort of staked this piece around at this point, we're actually going to use the 7 diminished chord, and that's going to give us a little bit of a different option than what we've heard so far. And what that's going to allow us to do is sort of take this detour right here. All right, now as you can see, going from the 1 to the 5/7 of the 4, the 5/7 of the 4 is the 1 chord, but in its dominant form. So this is an F dominant 7th chord, and a great way to switch between a regular 1 chord and a 1 chord that is functioning as the 5/7 of the 4 is to use this little 7 dominant chord, because it's a wonderful bridge the way that its voices work, and that allows you to set up into a really cool progression where we hit the 4, then we hit the minor 4, because I just can't resist it. I can't resist the minor 4. I love it way too much. And it's also, remember, the minor 4 is also kind of set up by the 7 diminished, right? You can think of the notes in the minor 4 as notes of the 7 diminished, and so even more parallels are being drawn here, which makes it look like, as a composer, you know what you're doing, right? That leads us beautifully to the 1, and finally a 5/7. And for the very end of our piece, I couldn't resist just a good old-fashioned fanfare where you're sort of just hitting the 1, going away from the 1, coming back to the 1. So let's see how we approach this sort of last fanfare here. So again, we have our 1 to our common tone diminished chord. It had to show up at least one more time before the end. Then we have our 1 to our 5/7. We have this little figure again, because this is a lot of fun, and you wouldn't want to just play it one time. You need to get your money's worth out of it. So I gave it to you twice. And then finally we have our 1, and then we crash down on the big final 1 that does have the do and the bass, so it would be considered our perfect authentic cadence. And there you have it, the harmonies for this little sonatina in F major. Let's go ahead and take a listen to what this sounds like on the piano. And that does it for our review process. Remember, you can find all of the documents from this review and any Piano Dojo episode on my website at pianodojo.com. Please remember to subscribe and to share this channel with anybody who is looking for answers about the piano. In our next unit, we'll be moving on to rootless voicings. So until then, happy practicing.